For now, however, we are here to learn, as I alluded to, from one of our neighbors. So Frank Sherman is a longtime prosecutor with lots of experience, including working in New York City with Rudy Giuliani. And so he is currently now, we're so glad to say, a full-time resident of Eagles Nest. And again, our friend and neighbor. And we're really lucky to be able to learn from him today. So please help me in welcoming Frank Sherman to the podium.
Thank you, Lacey. Not sure I've ever seen this many people voluntarily want to talk to a prosecutor.
They left.
They turn it off.
Oh,
Before I get into the indictments,
thank you.
let me just
I thought it was
take a
funny.
moment to say it's been personally distressing to me, and no matter what your political persuasion, it is a sad thing to watch somebody go from this and this to this and this. That is, of course, the mugshot for Rudy Giuliani from Fulton County, Georgia, where he's been indicted. A lot of people have speculated about how long he spent in front of the mirror deciding on exactly what to look like in this picture. I can tell you that I don't think Rudy spent any time, because he's had that look for over 30 years. And all I can say about this picture is it was taken at a time when I had a little more hair and Rudy had a lot more sense. Okay, so my plan is to speak briefly about some of the things that I've noticed as a former prosecutor about the cases that are pending, and then just open it up to people with questions. But before we get into sort of specifics of the indictment, it might be useful to remind everybody who I'm sure is well aware of these things, sort of the timeline. November 3, 2020 was election. And by the next day, Trump obviously was telling all the lies about the election. January 6, 2021 was the vote day in Congress to certify the Electoral College votes. And it was also the day of the insurrection. Shortly thereafter, Congress created the January 6th committee, and by June and July of 2022, the committee was holding public hearings, which I'm sure many of you probably saw some of, in which they were putting on live witnesses. November 15th of 2022, Trump announced that he was running again for president in 2024. And 3 days later, on November 18th, Attorney General Garland appointed Jack Smith as special counsel for the Department of Justice. Let me say up front, I don't know Jack Smith. I no longer work for the Department of Justice. I have no inside information, and my views are not those.
I didn't get it. I got that when I did the second one.
On December 22nd of 2022, the January 6th committee issued its final report and made criminal referrals to the Justice Department. That is, the committee made certain suggestions to the Department of Justice about who they thought merited indictment and for what. And we probably all remember that following the committee's work, both the public hearings and the final report, there was increasing pressure on Attorney General Garland to answer the question, what are you doing? Well, as you will also recall, there's been hundreds of people from the January 6th events who were charged in the District of Columbia and mostly pled guilty. Some went to trial. Included in that were members of the Oath Keepers and members of the Proud Boys, who, among other things, were indicted and some convicted for seditious conspiracy, which is a difficult charge and one that the Attorney General obviously authorized. So that brings us to 2023 and the fact that prosecutors are looking at Trump and wondering, what's going to happen next. Well, I'm going to jump around a little bit, but let me take the bottom case first, which is the New York State case. So that case was indicted by the district attorney in Manhattan on March 30th of 2023. That was the first time a president or a former president has ever been indicted in our history. And that case charges Trump with falsifying business records relating to the Stormy Daniels payments that he made shortly before the election in 2016 through Michael Cohen, his former attorney. And you may also recall that my old office, the Southern District of New York, had prosecuted Michael Cohen for some of his activities relating to that, but had chosen not to indict Trump. The district attorney made the decision to charge Trump with having basically falsified the records relating to Trump's reimbursement of Michael Cohen. After Cohen made the payment, Trump paid him back in a series of checks, which he listed as relating to a retainer agreement they had, which didn't exist. So that's what that case is about. It's probably the least significant politically. It does have some issues that we can talk about later, but it's one type of crime, that is falsifying business records, and 34 counts all relate to different checks and other documents relating to that payment scheme by Trump. So we also know that in Georgia, through the January 6th committee, everybody became very well aware that there were a lot of things going on after the election by Trump trying to change the result, including his famous phone call to the Secretary of State. People may have seen the election workers, Ruby Freeman and her daughter, testified at the January 6th committee. There were a lot of things that the Fulton County District Attorney was looking at and continued to look at as we got into 2023. When Jack Smith was appointed at the end of November, in November of 2022, it became clear that absent some activity by the Department of Justice, it was going to be very embarrassing. Jack Smith, in the two cases that he ultimately indicted, took a very specific view of what he was going to proceed on. And when a prosecutor is looking at indicting a case, you have two immediate issues. One is getting it indicted, which requires you go into a grand jury if you're charging felonies. And the second is, can you convict the person of what you intend to indict him for? And so with regard to the election case that Jack Smith brought, that case, in contrast to the Georgia case, really shows us how prosecutors make different decisions based on what their objectives are. Jack Smith indicted both of his cases between June and August, June and August of this year. And his objective was clearly to get Trump to trial before the 2024 election. In order to do that, particularly with respect to the election case, he did not charge anyone but Trump, naming unindicted co-conspirators, and he simplified what he charged Trump with. The reason I believe that he did that is, first of all, the more defendants you have in a case, the more motions you have, the more differing issues you have, all of which have to be resolved. And if you want to get things moving quickly, you make the charges as simple as possible and the number of defendants as low as possible. By focusing on Trump in that election case, he eliminated a lot of the issues that are going on in Georgia right now, where Trump's indicted with 18 other people. With regard to the Florida case, which is the classified documents case, he didn't have a whole lot of discretion as to what he thought about charging. The facts were pretty strong, and the only issue really was where he was going to bring the case. You know that he ultimately brought it in Florida, and he could have brought it in the District of Columbia because the conduct regarding the classified documents affected both jurisdictions. I believe in that case, he made the decision to again eliminate what would have been a very time-consuming argument about the right venue for the case by putting it in Mar-a-Lago, which most people think is a more friendly, or putting it in the Southern District of Florida, a more friendly venue for Trump, to eliminate any arguments about that. The problem in terms of Florida for Jack Smith is that the judge who was appointed to the case, we already have some track record for as not particularly friendly to the government with regard to investigations of Trump. And we also know that the jury pool from the counties where that case will be tried is a much more pro-Trump jury pool than the District of Columbia or New York. So in addition to venue, which is one of the types of issues, as I said, you look at what charges you're going to bring. Now, in Georgia, the district attorney decided to use a number of statutes, including RICO, which Jack Smith obviously did not decide to use. And RICO is a statute originally passed under federal law, and then a lot of states passed their own statutes. And it's really meant to punish organized, complicated, wide-ranging criminal activity going beyond a particular violation or any particular defendant. So it's much more powerful and broader than a normal conspiracy statute. And the conspiracy is just two or more people agreeing to commit a crime. Well, when you charge a RICO, you have to show that these people who are involved in the criminal activity were all part of an enterprise and that they used different criminal acts to support that enterprise. And what the Georgia prosecutor has charged is that the 19 people, including Trump, that she's charged, were part of an association in fact that was designed to get the 2020 election overturned. Now, when you actually look at the charges in the Georgia case and the federal election case, they go over a lot of the same factual material. But as I said, Jack Smith decided to limit himself to Trump to get the case moving quickly. Whereas in Georgia, they've charged all the people conceivably that they could name as co-conspirators. So we know that several of the unindicted co-conspirators in the federal case are the same as the named defendants in the Georgia case, like Rudy Giuliani. The Georgia case serves a very useful purpose in terms of the overall picture of bringing Trump to account, because not only does it lay out the number of people from Washington and Georgia and elsewhere that he utilized, but unlike the federal case, if Trump were to actually be reelected in 2024, the Georgia case cannot be dismissed by the president or his attorney general. The Georgia case cannot result in a pardon by the president. And the Georgia case laid out the scope of the activities by the co-conspirators. So it really fleshes out for the public, even more broadly than the federal case, to what extent this conspiracy operated. I have other thoughts, but at this point, throwing it open to people who might have specific questions. Becky.
Frank, what do you think the impact will be of having first two defendants in the Georgia case tried in late October? How will that impact?
I'm going to repeat the question. The question was, what is the possible effect of having the first two defendants in the Georgia case tried this October, while the trial date has not been set for Trump and the other 16 defendants, or 15? The effect is not good. And that is the problem with bringing a case against a lot of people with a lot of difficult charges. It's really, RICO cases are very difficult to work through, both for the judge and to ultimately make the jury understand what's going on. But it had to be anticipated that there were going to be very complicated motions filed in that Georgia case. And it had to be unrealistic to expect that everybody was going to be able to be tried immediately. The problem seems to be that under Georgia law, you are entitled to a speedy trial, and you are entitled to one under federal law, but under Georgia law, these two defendants have been able to basically say, I'm ready to go to trial and I'm not going to file any motions. Let's just do it. The downside for the prosecutor is you're going to put on all your case to prove that RICO enterprise and series of predicate acts, and you're going to give the other defendants a preview of everything that they're going to see, and you're going to lock the witnesses in to testify in October to whatever they say, so that if they have any kind of inconsistency when they ultimately testify, let's say against Trump, they're going to be able to be cross-examined and impeached with those inconsistencies. An even bigger problem for having that trial in October is for Jack Smith, because he's undoubtedly using not the exact same cast of witnesses, but a similar cast of witnesses. And I'm sure he's not too thrilled about having anybody tried in advance of his trial, which starts next March.
difficulty in understanding what it's required to make the connection of co-conspiracy as opposed to just being inspired by. Are those the same things, or how do you attempt to make that connection? What's necessary for it?
Well, it's not the same thing. You do have to show an agreement by people to engage in this activity to reach this particular objective. You can show that by circumstantial evidence or by direct evidence. It's pretty rare in any kind of conspiracy case, to have some document that shows that everybody agreed to commit this crime. So it typically is proof through the testimony of someone who was involved in the conspiracy, along with all the circumstances surrounding it. So in this particular case, it's pretty obvious that there were a cast of characters going around the country telling the election lies. There were multiple people going around setting up false electors. There were a number of people trying to get people in the Justice Department to cooperate with Trump's complaints about the election. And there were multiple people trying to get Mike Pence to do what he didn't do on January 6th, which is delay things. So those circumstances can all be used to let a jury conclude that, yeah, there was this actual organized agreement, even though it wasn't in writing, to try to get the election overturned, which is the objective they've charged in both the federal election case and the Georgia case.
Mr. Jeff.
Thinking from the general public point of view, very frustrating. What can you do to dispel in our minds the fact that there seems to be a two-tier justice system? One for the rich, one for the poor. And the length of time it's taking to take action against what are, I think, to the common person, a pretty obvious case of great illegalities.
Well, I'm not sure I can totally address the complete divide, and I'm not sure that if we went to a Trump rally, they would agree with your premise that everybody agrees there was great illegality here. But yeah, there is a difference in what happens in the justice system for people with a lot of money and people that don't have any. Starting with how many lawyers you can hire and where you can kind of delay things. But with regard to these cases, none of these prosecutors, I am quite sure, took lightly the fact that they were indicting a person who had been the president of the United States. Because the worst thing you could possibly do is indict him and then not convict him, because that just feeds into his narrative. So that's another point that you can glean from what Jack Smith did. Congress, the January 6th committee, recommended that Trump be charged with seditious conspiracy and with incitement at the January 6th rally, the insurrection. And he chose not to charge those things in his election case because, again, it would severely slow down the pace of the prosecution, because you'd have major fights that might end up going to the Supreme Court about his First Amendment rights and whether it was incitement or simply his ability to comment on current events. It's the same kind of thing he's fighting right now, where Jack Smith's trying to get a gag order relating to the pending case. And there was also a decision not to charge Trump, unlike the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, with seditious conspiracy, because there hadn't been enough of a track record of using that statute to prosecute people. And the objective here is to get Trump to trial and to convict him. And the best way to do that is make the case simple and make the legal issues as minimal as possible. So unlike the Georgia case, which I don't know, but I suspect is going to take a long time to get to trial, and probably in segments, because, you know, I did this mafia trial with 13 defendants, 9 of which went to trial for 8 months. To have 17 defendants on trial at the same time is a zoo. So I doubt that the judge down in Georgia is going to let that happen. And before it can happen, there's going to be so many issues to resolve that that trial is not going to probably get tried before the election.
Forward to March and what I will call the election fraud case in DC. And there is a successful conviction. Is the judge required to sentence Donald Trump to prison? Or does she have discretion as to whether or not that happens? Secondly, if she does sentence him to prison and there is an appeal, does he have discretion as to whether he can be released pending the appeal or whether he has to serve his time in prison pending the appeal?
The judge definitely has discretion in terms of the sentencing. Nothing that Trump's been charged with in that particular case has a mandatory minimum jail sentence. And normally under federal law, if you appeal your conviction, there is then a determination made about whether you should have bail pending appeal. And in light of what has gone on so far with regard to Trump, I can't imagine that there would not be bail pending appeal for him. There are a lot of different levels of not incarceration, but something less than probation that the judge can do. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of difficulties involved in physically having Trump in a penitentiary. I mean, the Secret Service going to sit in his cell. You know, he could be confined to house arrest for whatever the period of his sentence is, which seems a little more doable. But I think a lot of these people are more concerned about simply convicting him and having people understand that the legal system work to hold him accountable than necessarily seeing him in a jail cell. I'm not saying that shouldn't or won't happen, but there's a lot of difficulties involved in putting him physically in prison.
Two questions. Donald Trump raised a lot of money by spreading lies about winning the election. Is he being investigated for mail fraud or something similar to that? And then second, what is your opinion about the 14th Amendment of the Constitution and whether or not Trump can even be on the ballot for president?
Well, first of all, I don't know what he's being investigated for beyond what he's already been charged with. So I don't have any information about that. And with regard to the 14th Amendment, you know, and for those of you who don't know, there's a provision in the 14th Amendment that basically says, if you're an officer of the United States who swore an oath to uphold the Constitution and you thereafter engage in an insurrection or give aid and comfort to those who do, you are barred from holding office again in the United States. And there's an argument that's been made by conservatives as well as liberals that that provision should bar Trump from running again in 2024. I know in Minnesota, Steve Simon has said that he can't make that, he's not authorized to make that determination. And it seems a little problematic, both politically and legally, before anybody's convicted him of any direct involvement in the insurrection, to say that we're not going to let him be on the ballot. I think it's a bigger political problem than a legal problem, because there's going to be an awful lot of people upset if they can't vote for him because some other politician made the decision that he shouldn't be on the ballot. But that's to be determined as events unfold.
If he is not convicted of any of these, can he be indicted for other crimes? And do you think that's likely to happen?
Well, he certainly could be indicted for other crimes, and he could be indicted theoretically in other venues too, like Michigan or Wisconsin, or, you know, wherever there were fake electors being put forward. Theoretically, he could be prosecuted. I don't, at this point at least, anticipate that's going to happen while these cases are pending. And, you know, going back to the Florida case for a moment, you know, that's the strongest case factually, because he had the documents. He had no excuse to have them, despite what he's currently claiming. And the biggest problem there is just, you know, whether there's going to be a sympathetic jury, and also, you know, whether people are going to buy into the idea that this is just an effort to keep him from running, which we're going to hear endlessly for the next 6 months. But he could be indicted for other crimes, absolutely, even if he's acquitted of these. And keep in mind, in a criminal case, first of all, there's normally a jury of 12, and all 12 have to agree to either find the person guilty or not guilty. If there's anything less than 12, then it's a hung jury. And from Trump's perspective, a hung jury is as good as an acquittal. So you only need one person to screw it up for the prosecutor.
Would we expect the January 6th case, for example, if Jack Smith is focused on Trump in order to get things moving along at a faster pace, after that plays out, would we expect some of those unindicted conspirators to be charged?
Well, that's another interesting thing about the interplay between the Georgia case and the federal case, because to the extent that the Georgia case has indicted people who Jack Smith has called an unindicted co-conspirator, such as Rudy Giuliani or John Eastman, they are under tremendous pressure to figure out what they want to do, because they could theoretically reach a deal where they plead guilty to something and then cooperate in both cases. Frequently, defendants, when they're faced with potential state and federal charges, and they conclude that they're probably going to get convicted of something, they wanted, if they're going to do time, they want to do it in a federal facility normally. So he could, you know, one of these people like Rudy Giuliani could theoretically, if they just want to reach a deal in Georgia to plead to that, they could have an understanding that any sentence they get would be served in a federal prison, and they would agree to testify at both the federal election case trial and the other trial. To the extent that the people that are already indicted in Georgia don't decide to plead or cooperate, I would anticipate that Jack Smith, assuming Trump's convicted, that he might well decide to go after those people also, particularly depending on what happens with the Georgia case.
Could you describe how we get an impartial jury?
It's gonna be a long process. You know, when I did this mafia case, which was a long time ago, it took us 11 days to get a jury, and it was going to be an anonymous jury, which meant we didn't know people's names, we didn't know where they lived. Twice the number of people that are in this room were called in for jury selection. They all filled out a questionnaire with many, many questions about their feelings about various issues, including organized crime. And after the people who were obviously biased or had some other problem were weeded out, then we still had to find people who could sit through an 8-month trial. And that's going to be the same issue in Georgia, if not even longer. So one of the realities is that how many working people are going to sit through that length of a trial? So you're going to end up with either a lot of retired people or unemployed people, which I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it definitely affects the nature of the jury pool. You do not have to have a blank mind to be an unbiased juror. What you have to be able to do is acknowledge that whatever you've heard outside of the courtroom, whether before jury selection or after, you're going to base your decision in the case only on what you hear in the courtroom and see in the courtroom that the judge tells you you can use. And if you can do that, and you can convince the lawyers on both sides that you could do that, then you're good to go as a juror, even if you're a Trumper or a progressive in real life. It's just a question of what you can put aside to come to a verdict based on the evidence. And no matter how much pretrial publicity you've seen, and in this case, obviously, it's going to be very difficult to find people that have never heard of any of this. They'll get a jury. The other shocking thing is, for people that pay attention to the news, is how many people actually don't know very much about any of this.
I'm just curious, if Trump happens to be elected but is under house arrest in November of 2024, can he still serve as president, or can he be disqualified?
Well, you can serve as president from your bedroom, but whether ultimately he's going to be found to be disqualified from holding office would depend on the nature of the conviction and the nature of the sentence. But I would anticipate that if he actually won the Electoral College, that he would get sworn in.
Going back to the 14th Amendment argument, Colorado's case seems to be the first and maybe the strongest, as it's put together by a lot of conservatives, Republicans, and Democrats. What is your opinion on the viability of that case and the likelihood of success on either party?
Well, as I mentioned, I think, it's going to be a little different in each state. And I don't know the specifics of Colorado law, but in terms of the way the decision will get made, whether it's by the judge or by the Secretary of State in that particular state, I think there's going to be a lot of people that are very hesitant to pull the plug on Trump under this legal theory. when we know, even from the last election, that 49% of the people in the country are ready to vote for it. And whether that will create more societal problems than letting him be on the ballot. So I don't know that I can predict the outcome of any of this, you know. I mean, it's certainly a valid legal theory, but there's a lot of people that are going to be concerned about whether people are taking things into their own hands if they don't like the way that issue gets resolved.
As a follow-up on that issue, can that issue go to the Supreme Court since it's a states' rights issue or not? And what's the likelihood of that occurring?
Well, it's actually a federal constitutional issue. So yes, I anticipate that it would go to the Supreme Court. And that would be interesting in terms of the makeup of the Supreme Court right now. I'm pretty sure they're not going to want to deal with it because they've already managed to elect one president. And I'm not sure they want to do it again.
I know I've got 2 questions queued up, but Frank, I'm just giving you a 10-minute warning if you have additional content you wanted to get to, or if you're okay staying in Q&A mode.
I'm fine, and you pull the plug whenever you need to.
Okay, perfect. Good.
Looking at the Georgia case with 19 defendants, would you be comfortable in that position of prosecuting that, or would you have broken it up into different segments?
Well, I mean, I would be comfortable with indicting 19 defendants. I would probably recognize that it was unlikely I was going to get them all to trial at the same time. And I think she also, I'm sure that was always her intent to bring the indictment that she did bring, but she also had the comfort level of knowing before that case was indicted on August 14th, that Jack Smith had already indicted his case on August 1st. And so she was basically the backup for his case. And she didn't have to worry about whether her case was going to get done before the election or not, even though I'm quite sure she would like it to be.
Frank, I was wondering, the legal costs are extremely high. And the lawyer's costs, how much it costs to be in court. Is there a national treasure chest for these defendants, or who's actually paying for their defense? Do you know?
Well, we know Trump's not paying for Giuliani's, that's for sure. Well, in the federal cases, if you are indigent, there is a federal public defender service. And actually, despite what people think, those are some of the best lawyers around. So you're very well represented if you have a federal defender representing you. If you're not indigent, you're responsible for your own legal fees or finding someone who's willing to pay for it. Now, one of the issues that's already come up in a couple of the cases is whether some of these lawyers have conflicts. And that's because obviously during the investigative stage, Trump wanted to try to keep control of everybody. And so he was willing to pay for their lawyers. So take Cassidy Hutchinson, for instance, who testified at the January 6th committee. She originally had a Trump paid for lawyer, and she wasn't cooperating at all with the committee. When it finally dawned on her that that lawyer might not be working in her interest, and she got a new lawyer, she suddenly had a pretty amazing story to tell. Well, the prosecutors in the case, I mean, it's even more important at this stage because you can't have an attorney representing one of these defendants who also represented a witness who's going to be testifying at trial unless you get a waiver of that potential conflict. And the conflict is, if you're Trump's lawyer and you're going to cross-examine, let's say Giuliani pleads and cooperates. And let's say you represented Giuliani during the investigative stage. If you're Trump's lawyer and you're going to cross-examine Giuliani based on information that Giuliani told you under the attorney-client privilege when you were his attorney, that can't be done legally unless Giuliani waives that conflict of interest and Trump waives that conflict of interest. Because it's also a problem for Trump that the attorney might feel, well, I used to represent Rudy, and so I'm going to hold back a little bit on really going after him. And that's not in the best interest of Trump. So they both would have to waive that conflict. And because Trump had a very small cadre of lawyers who were going around representing a lot of these witnesses in the investigations, this issue is definitely coming up and has to get resolved through trial, which is another thing that slows down the trial, because not only do you have to have hearings about whether the conflict exists and whether it's going to be waived, but if it doesn't get waived and the judge orders that somebody get a new lawyer, that lawyer is going to then claim, well, I need so much extra time to get ready for trial, and that delays things even further. So who pays for the lawyer and who those lawyers represent are both significant issues.
In the campaign, use their money to spend it to spend. I'm sorry. Can Trump's campaign money be used to pay for the defendants?
I'm not an election lawyer. I'm not sure if his actual campaign funds can be used. Certainly PAC money, I think, can be spent on lawyers. And we know that Trump has been raising a ton of money that's being used for legal fees. Whether he's running that through his campaign account or not, I don't know exactly how that works.
More questions? I'm curious. Oh, Lucy. I'm just curious, there's a lot of talk about the legal factors of the case and then the political considerations of the case, and they're often like different but similar, and how you weigh the balance of, do you consider the political factors equally as the legal factors, or just how do you balance those when you think about the indictments?
You mean in terms of prosecuting the case?
Right, like, do you do it before the election, or,
Well, the normal thing is there are no political factors, but the reality is that in this kind of case, there has to be a political consideration. And part of that is certainly with the Department of Justice, they've had a long-standing policy of trying not to bring a case right before an election because it could affect it either way. And so that's why you want to try to get things resolved as quickly as you can and as far in advance of an election as you can, or you're going to end up holding off till after the election. So that's why I think Jack Smith moved very quickly and with very succinct charges so that he could get this resolved. Because if he gets Trump to trial in March, he's good in terms of Department of Justice policy about how much time is left before the election. I think he has said that he anticipates that trial will take about 3 weeks, which is actually relatively short for the nature of the case. And if he gets that done, then it's still a question, the New York case is scheduled for March 2, but I think that judge is pretty flexible about when that case goes. But I mean, all of these things could fall into place, but at the same time, you're going to have Trump constantly complaining because he has to physically be in the courtroom. that you're interfering with his campaign. And you're interfering with his First Amendment rights.
There's been a judge who's telling Trump, I believe, not to talk about stuff to the public and so forth. I guess it's not a gag order, but he obviously does. I mean, he badmouths the judge, he badmouths the prosecutors. How does that play into it? When does a gag order come? When can that start to get into trouble?
Well, so far it's just admonitions. There is a motion pending by Jack Smith to actually impose a gag order, which Trump just responded to yesterday, I think, and which is still in the stages of being litigated before the judge decides. But that's a pretty severe step. And again, even if the judge imposes it, the wording of that order is going to be vague enough that it's hard to believe, particularly knowing Trump, who could care less about rules, that he's going to be significantly silenced. And then the judge is going to be faced with, are you actually going to hold this guy in contempt and conceivably even put him in jail for the trial, which is uncharted territory.
Got a question over here. So, prior to that election, to the election, where the Trump lost, we heard that they talked about what if he lost the election, and that he was advised or whatever, his friends or colleagues or whatever said, well then just, and then this Giuliani, I don't know, we've seen the Giuliani thing where, oh, the election was stolen. And sort of started with Giuliani, and then Trump echoed that when he lost the election. So kind of planned that out ahead of time, just in case he lost the election. And we have all these indictments and whatever, we know that Trump is a gambler, in a lot of ways. And he didn't just think of this. I don't think. It's not, he's got good advisors, whatever, that are on his side. I know that you can't answer this question really without just speculation, but how much of this did he say, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if this happens? What if that? What are my chances of going to trial? What are my chances of being convicted? What are and I'll gamble it, or his advisor said gamble it, because look at what's going on. We don't, if everything you've said is like, probably he won't get convicted and this and that and the other thing, or he'll be elected before anything happens, etc. Do you understand what my question is?
Yeah.
And you know what, is this the elephant in the room? Maybe.
Well, I do think he's thought about a lot of this in advance, but I also think just if you have sort of observed his behavior in the last couple of weeks, I mean, he's clearly concerned now about these cases, and whether or not he physically will go to jail, it's certainly, in addition to possibly keeping him out of office, it can cost him a lot of money. And we haven't even talked about the civil cases that are pending against him for defamation and things like that. So, I don't think he takes the legal situation lightly at this point, and I'm quite sure that he's been told about the election and about the other situations that he's looking at a lot of trouble. At the same time, when you look at the Florida case, the classified documents, I mean, is that rational behavior to having for a year been asked to give the documents back nicely and then you still don't do it? I mean, it's not totally understandable what his thought process was in that situation. But I think it's becoming clear to him that the federal legal system is not going to bend to his will. And particularly in DC, he's got a major problem.
We're going to do one last question from our friend Brad Carlson. Sorry.
Thanks. Right, so. What would be your perspective as a prosecutor if the Georgia trial is televised? Both from just like in general prosecuting, and then specifically this situation with Trump and how it will go down. What's your perspective on it?
Well, unlike federal court where televised trials are not permitted, and so I've never experienced one personally. You know, the fear's always been that the lawyers are going to play to the cameras and it's going to become a circus. I think the educational value of letting people see exactly what happens and making their own decision. You know, most of the people in this room look to me to be old enough to remember the O.J. Simpson trial. And everybody obviously had their own conclusion before the jury reached theirs. You know, if the judge keeps a tight rein on the case, and, you know, it's going to be probably more problematic to control Trump than to control the lawyers in that trial. It can be very beneficial in terms of letting people know exactly how the system works and that he got a fair trial. At the same time, you know, it's going to be interesting because the judge in Georgia is, I mean, he's got experience as a prosecutor, but he's a pretty new judge. And, you know, it's a pretty challenging thing to run that kind of a trial with the whole country watching you. So there's a lot of pressure, but I think overall, it probably would be beneficial if the federal trials were televised, but that's very unlikely because of all the rule changes that would have to be made.
Thank you so much. We have learned so much from you, Frank.